Next, from Springfield, historian and author David Garrow delivers a presentation at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library on his book Rising Star, The Making of Barack Obama. This runs about 1 hour.
Good evening. We're going to get started here. Just want to welcome everybody, and just wanted to welcome you to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. My name is Michael Little. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. We're very, very excited tonight to have a special guest with us. Currently, we have a brand new exhibit over at the museum. It's From Illinois to the White House. And the great thing about this exhibit is that it depicts the story and tells the story of 4 great leaders that have roots here in Illinois that later went on to the White House to become great presidents and great leaders of our country during some very difficult times. Our special guest tonight, David, in addition to being an incredible author, American historian, award winner of many great books, including his book, Bearing the Cross on Martin Luther King, and his great book that he's going to discuss tonight, on Barack Obama, Rising Star, The Making of Barack Obama. David's book, like our exhibit across the street, really depicts and highlights some of the great strengths and leadership strengths that President Obama had that eventually took him from our great state here in Illinois to the White House. And so with that, if you guys could all help me to welcome our special guest tonight, award-winning author, and our special guest tonight, David Garrow.
Well, it's great to be back in Springfield. This is I think my first time back in 5 years now. There are at least about 15, 18, 20 people here in the room who I either interviewed for the book and or are in the book. So this is a little more intimidating by some measure than the usual book talk, because there are all these people. Senator Jacobs here is a great example, whom if I talk about Springfield might stand up and want to argue with me about something. But I'll tell one little Springfield story, and then for my own safety talk about pre-Springfield things. But as a fair number of you know, President Obama during calendar year 2016 actually took the time to read about 90% of this book in typescript. It was printed out for him, and he had these, big old-fashioned black 3-ring binders. And then my second and third times to the White House, we sat there in that little dining room just off the Oval Office and paged through it, and he told me what there was in the book that he didn't like seeing. And one of those things, and these were not necessarily great issues that he wanted to disagree about. Sometimes they were very small things, whether it's about how good was a poll that was taken in 1999, or how good or poor a poker player was he. Because I had at least 5, all former senators or former senators, tell me about one particular final poker game in particular, where I believe we've got 5 eyewitnesses saying that it was a very unsuccessful, painful night for Barack. Well, when we come to that point in chapter 9 of my manuscript, and this was all off the record, so I've got to sound oblique here since we're being filmed, but someone really wanted to convince me that he never lost badly at poker ever. And that's a insightful example of how one person's memory of history doesn't always match up very well with everyone else's memories of what happened. Now, let me talk here primarily about pre-Springfield years, because once we go to the Q&A, I'm certain that people will very largely want to ask about Springfield, and so we'll not be shorting from Springfield discussion whatsoever. I started reading for this book in early 2008, just after Barack won the Iowa caucuses, because I was embarrassed that I knew virtually nothing about him, even though I'd spent much of my life as a historian writing about the African American experience in the U.S. And the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. And I spent most of 2008 reading everything that was published about Barack in various magazines and newspapers. And again, I was disappointed by how unthorough, how incurious, and how oftentimes lazy this campaign biographical journalism was. I'll mention three things and then talk about the first two. All throughout 2007, 2008, 2009, nobody ever made the effort to go find the woman with whom Barack lived in Hyde Park for over 2 years during his community organizing years, 1985 to 1988. And that is the transformative period in Barack's life. Everyone who knew Barack in high school, in college, in his early working years in New York, up through 1985, remembers him as a perfectly nice guy, but in no way remarkable. That's the Barack up through age 24. In contrast, after those 3 years in Chicago, when Barack gets to Harvard Law School in the fall of 1988, everyone who meets Barack there at Harvard, really from day one, fellow classmates, faculty members, unanimously felt that this was a remarkably impressive young man whom we'd all be hearing about down the road. So very quickly it became clear to me that that was the contrast between the Barack of 85 and the Barack of 88. And Barack's transformation, those 3 years in Chicago, is in two parts. One part is his working life down in Roseland and Altgeld Gardens on the far south side, where for the first time in his life he is in a black community. It's his first exposure to African American people and African American culture. When he's growing up in Hawaii, going to a wonderful elite prep school, there are barely 2 other black students in this pretty large school. Similarly, in college, at Occidental, at Columbia, when he's working in New York, his friendship network is almost entirely international students, primarily Pakistani. And during the campaign, the Pakistani guys wanted to stay way off the radar screen, so people did not hear about them. But most importantly of all, Sheila Yeager, the woman Barack lived with, a very intense relationship that spanned from 1986 to 1991, 1992. No one had made the effort to find Sheila. And to find her, all you had to do was go to Regenstein Library at the U of C, since Barack's address was a matter of public record, and look in the student directory and see who else was living at that same address. That's how I found my way to Sheila. We also found a very nice couple that lived upstairs right above them. Similarly, Rob Fisher, who was Barack's best friend at Harvard, best friend up through the mid-1990s, it was Rob who did most of the editorial work on Dreams from My Father, not Bill Ayers, as you may have read about in places out there on the web. And so to me, as a historian, it was astonishing to me, both with Sheila and with Rob, that here I was in 2009, 2010, discovering and hearing the stories of these people who were crucial figures in Barack's life, whom the campaign journalism hadn't put out there at all. Similarly, and there are all sorts of people here tonight, Dan Shulman, Mike Lawrence, various senatorial colleagues, Senator Jacobs, Senator Link, all throughout, right up through when I'm spending a lot of time here in 2011, 2012, there was never even a good magazine article about Barack Obama, state legislator. No one came down here and really did a thorough piece of Springfield legwork. And this is the president of the, I'll leave out the adjective, United States. So I was again and again and again amazed by how much untouched territory, human territory, there was for me to discover. The most fun part of this, in many ways, came right at the beginning. I went to Chicago for the first time in late March of 2009, about 8 weeks after Barack was inaugurated, initially just to see the three community organizing mentors, Greg, Mike, and Jerry, the guys who sort of trained Barack, 85 to 88. And the very first day, Greg Galuzzo says to me, "Oh, you should go see Marianne Wilson," who was the attorney who had pro bono incorporated all of the community groups, done all the correspondence with the Secretary of State's office and with the IRS. And tax lawyers saved their files. So 2 mornings later, on South Wacker, Miss Wilson brings out this manila folder from 1987, and it's all these documents typed by Barack himself in 87, including a list of the 50 people or so who are all the active members of his community group down in Roseland, the Developing Communities Project. So right there at the beginning, I had this list of about 50 people with their addresses and phone numbers from that time, maybe 3 of whom campaign journalists had found. And that, for me, was the beginning of the slippery slope, was going and looking for these people. Now, folks who lived in public housing in 1987 and who had family names like Smith are a little bit harder to find than former senators or former Senate staffers or fellow classmates at Harvard Law School. But it was a great pleasure to be able to spend so much time on the far South Side, meeting these church ladies and meeting the clergy members. That world that Barack got sort of airdropped into in 1985, 1986 was primarily Roman Catholic, black Roman Catholic, because that was the congregation base that this existing community organizing network had, going back to when they first started working right after the closure of Wisconsin Steel, the beginning of the steel collapse in Chicago in 1980. And it's very much this church network, both clergy and former Jesuits who left the church to go into community work. These are the people that trained Barack 85, 86, 87. And chapter 4, which is this story in the book, is, to my mind, the most important part of the story because it tells the story of this transformation from a sort of green 24-year-old into a mature young man whom everybody at Harvard thinks is a star. Now, the second thing I want to take some time to talk about, and this runs very much counter to so much of what was out there on the web during the presidency, is how, especially at Punahou, the elite prep school that Barack went to for high school in Hawaii, and again at Occidental and Columbia for college, and then especially at Harvard, this was actually someone who had a superb quality, serious education, again and again. Now, even Barack himself in Dreams from My Father makes sort of fictional fun of what a bad student he was. And the self-portrayal that Barack gives of himself in Hawaii during prep school is a self-portrayal that no one who knew him at Punahou or in Honolulu agrees with whatsoever. And I got plenty of pushback on this in 2016 when I was in Washington, again being oblique, because once you write up your own version of your story, you sort of want to stick with that, even if everybody else who witnessed your life rather firmly disagrees with you. And so that's the real professional obligation that someone like myself as a historian has, is to do all the legwork and talk to as many people as you can, and do the most comprehensive and thorough job of gathering everyone's testimony and weighing that. And people who save old documents. Mike Lawrence is here tonight, and this is a great example of Mike digging out from some old computer all of these memos from when he was working with Barack and other legislators on campaign finance reform legislation in the late 1990s, legislation that Senator Jacobs very forcefully opposed. But having people who save documents is so wonderful. Many of the people who worked on Barack's U.S. Senate campaign in 2003, 2004, particularly John Cooper, K-U-P-P-E-R, saved so many documents from that campaign. And people who print out their emails and then save paper copies of their emails are a great modern day resource for people like me, because it means that the electronic record is not evaporating over time. Barack's academic grounding, academic training, is insufficiently heralded as explaining how someone this smart and talented became who he was. And I love the Harvard story, and it's very much a sort of inside life of a law school, of a law student in a law school. And so anyone who has a law degree, who's been through the experience of law school, I taught on law faculties for the better part of 20 years, most recently at Pitt. But the Harvard story is a wonderful blossoming of what tremendous intellectual and analytical potential Barack had as a 27-year-old even. He and Rob Fisher, whom I mentioned earlier, the best friend from 1988 right on through the 1990s, even before Dreams from My Father, Barack and Rob wrote together a book manuscript, remains unpublished. First Rob and then his mother at the family home down in southern Maryland found the typescript in 2 parts, and half of that manuscript, written in the spring of 1991, is Barack's thoughts on race. It's about 100 pages or so. The other 100 pages is on the economics of plant closings. Rob was someone who already had an economics PhD from that time, as of that time. And so it's not, you don't have to have a lot of experience as a historian to sort of know who wrote which chapter. But the story of that book manuscript, like the story of Sheila Yeager, the girlfriend in Chicago, That book manuscript is a part of chapter 5 of this biography. And so much of what Barack wrote then in 1991 directly foreshadows what he's saying about race and racial policy dynamics and racial dynamics when he's down here in Springfield dealing with legislation like driving while black. And it's a wonderfully rich story to see how he blossoms during those 3 years in law school. One of his professors, Jerry Frug, in a class on city law, ends up quoting Barack on the class's final exam. And it's just, I think for anyone who's spent any time in academia, to have, the final exam for a course that poses a question, quoting something that a student said during the course of the semester as part of the exam is something that, really none of us have ever heard of or experienced. And it's one, really tangibly documented example of what a remarkable presence Barack was, even at age 28 in 1990, 1991. Let me say just one piece of things about Springfield and then a little bit about '04. I would much rather we spend as much time as possible doing Q&A, given the quality of the audience here tonight. As I'm certain several of the senators and several of the staffers from that time who are here can testify even better than I can. When Barack arrives here at the beginning of 1997, he anticipates that the Illinois State Senate is going to be this public policy debating society where he can weigh in on the substance of great issues. We got lots of people laughing out loud. And I think I do a fair job in those chapters on the late 1990s in conveying how disappointed Barack was by how oftentimes partisan and unserious life in Pate Phillips' world was. And again, I belabor the obvious with this audience, so I'll do this very briefly, but throughout the whole first 6 years of Barack's time here, he's a junior member of the minority party in a chamber that is controlled by extremely conservative Republicans. Republicans who are more conservative than the John Boehner sort of people whom he subsequently encountered as president. Yet notwithstanding that, I would underscore two things about Barack's time here in Springfield. One, he does a very energetic job of going out and making close friends with Democrats who are not Chicago progressives, Denny, Terry, Larry, Walsh. And similarly, as many of you here again know very well, he does a very successful, productive job of working with Republicans like Dave Severson on public health and welfare, and Kirk Dillard, and even Ed Petka on the Judiciary Committee, Dan Cronin, much more moderate Republican. And so a lot of Barack's life here in Springfield was working and befriending conservative Democratic legislators. I don't think Senator Jacobs is going to get too angry if I refer to him as a conservative, and dealing really well with very conservative Republicans. And one of the things that I've gotten some amount of pushback from in the Northeast Corridor, and I spend very little of this book on Barack's presidency, but I think I am far from alone in feeling that Barack in Washington did not do as energetic and sustained a job month after month of working across the aisle as he did here in Springfield. And I think that is going to be a major issue in Obama historiography going forward across the decades. Think about how now, a century, and more later, what we have in terms of Lincoln literature here. But one of the real issues for Obama studies going forward is why Barack's very rich experience here in Springfield did not more deeply, formatively influence and inform his presidency. Now, I suggest very briefly, and I had this conversation in abbreviated form with Mike Lawrence before we began here this evening. When you've got a chief executive, and I'm referring to Jim Edgar here in this context here in Springfield, Illinois' governor back during the 1990s, it's a great advantage for a chief executive if you've got someone on your staff who will really argue and disagree with you. And similarly, it's a real disadvantage if you're a president of the United States and all of the people who are really close around you are only telling you how great you are and not disagreeing with you. And so one of, I think, the most valid disappointments about Barack's presidency is that he was unwilling to keep in the White House people who would really disagree and argue with him as equals. Now, during the campaigns, right on up through 2003, not only here but in his campaigns, and I won't mention people here, but Carroll Harwell ran his first state Senate campaign. There were people around Barack who would tell him very bluntly when he was wrong or ignorant about something. People who'd tell him during his unsuccessful congressional campaign in 2000 that he wasn't even quoting Martin Luther King correctly. But when you forsake taking on, keeping with you, people who can really help you rather than people who just pat you on the back, that's not a recipe for success. Let me say one last thing and then thank you and take questions from the floor. The last full chapter of this book is about Barack's time in the U.S. Senate. And it's a little bit of a reenactment of his arrival here in Springfield. Because when Barack first gets to the U.S. Senate in 2005, he's hoping that the U.S. Senate will give him this policy experience that he had found relatively lacking in Springfield. Instead, he finds that the U.S. Senate is a disappointment compared to the Illinois State Senate. And I think it's really without question the major influence in Barack at the end of 2006, beginning of 2007, deciding to run for the presidency in 2008, that the major thing pushing him towards this very early, unexpectedly early presidential campaign was how very underwhelmed he was by life as a United States Senator. And I don't think that's a story that has really made it into the wider public understanding of Barack's life course as well. So thank you all so much for being here tonight. It's tremendously heartwarming for me to have so many of you here tonight whom I met and spoke with while I was working on this book. The real joy that somebody like me experiences in doing this is the people you meet while doing it, because you draw strength from the people you interact with. Being a historian is otherwise a very lonely calling. The actual writing of this book took about 18 months. Without a day off. I'm not exaggerating. Every day for 18 months, I sat there, didn't leave the house much. And it's not only exhausting, it's very lonely. But the real purpose and calling of history is to do this, is to create as comprehensive and thorough a record as possible. That's what I sought to do with my 3 books on Dr. King, with my big history of Roe v. Wade, and with this book. And I'm very humbly appreciative of how I think this is a book that will live on very actively for decades to come. Thank you all very much.
Okay, so now we've got this part. When are you doing the presidency? Because that, I feel like I'm halfway there.
Right.
And so, okay, so tell me, not you?
No. I've never, I lived in Washington a fair amount, especially in the 1990s. Oh, I don't want to do World of Washington and presidential interviewing at all. The great joy for me is in finding people who've never been discovered. One of the things in my life I'm proudest of involves a woman named Joanne Robinson, passed away many years ago now. Mrs. Robinson is the person who really started the Montgomery bus boycott after Mrs. Parks was arrested. And now, in Black America, Mrs. Robinson and this Women's Political Council in Montgomery, the black women who started the boycott, it's a really well-known story in black history now. But when I first met Mrs. Robinson in 1984, there was one academic article by a great Alabama historian named Mills Thornton that identified Mrs. Robinson's importance. It's Mrs. Robinson who's mimeographing the leaflets asking people to stay off the buses in Montgomery the following Monday morning. So, I mentioned Sheila Yeager, I mentioned Rob Fisher, there are many people here from the world of Springfield. It gives me great joy in finding the unknown. But the inside life of Washington and the U.S. Congress, no, thank you. I'm happy to read the sort of Bob Woodward type books, and I'm on balance extremely positive about Bob Woodward. Don't take it the wrong way, but that's not where my joy comes from. Sabrina, they're in the back on your side.
Can you offer more insight and analysis of why Obama did not reach out more during his presidency?
Only about 1.5% of this book is really about the presidency. There's an epilogue that covers pretty much the campaign, the presidential campaign, but mainly with an emphasis on old parts of his life, whether Reverend Wright, Bill Ayers, etc., that popped back up during the campaign of the presidency. I think that Barack's failure, I said this earlier, so I'm repeating myself, I think Barack's failure at the beginning in 2009, 2010 to take with him to Washington, to the White House, people who would be able to disagree with him as equals. I think that was an error that had consequences, both in congressional relations and in other contexts. I think most of us here have read multiple accounts of his decision-making on Syria, and how most everyone thought that there had been a particular decision made to act with regard to the Assad dictatorship and its use of chemical weapons against civilian populations. And then all of a sudden, voila, after one single quick conversation with one aide, that decision is reversed. It doesn't happen. And that to me, and this is part of a much longer story, that to me is an exemplar of sadness.
Any clues as to how he picked up his oratorical skills?
Oh, that's a great one, and we've got some people here who could speak to that too. During the congressional campaign in 1999-2000, I think it's almost unanimous testimony that Barack was not a very good speaker, whether in black churches or anywhere else. And I think it's fair to say, and the transcripts that are all there on the web of Barack on the floor of the Illinois State Senate over those years sort of support this too, that right up through 2003, no one would have been nominating Barack Obama for any oratorical awards. Peter Fitzgerald is actually the best witness on this. That'll surprise a lot of people in this room. But former Senator Fitzgerald had been in the state Senate in 97, 98, had served on the local government committee with Barack. And Peter recounted to me how sometime late 2002, early 2003, he's at some church on the far south side of Chicago going around on a Sunday. This is before Peter Fitzgerald withdraws from running for re-election. And at one of these churches, he runs into Barack Obama, who's, a few months in on running for the, Democratic senatorial nomination. And Fitzgerald is just astonished at what a dramatically better speaker Obama is, early in 2003 than he remembered from, 6 years before. And I think that becomes even more pronounced over the course of 2003, early 2004. But the Barack Obama whom everyone sees at the Democratic convention in the summer of 2004, that Barack Obama did not exist as of 2002. And let me take this opportunity too. John Cooper, I mentioned earlier, K-U-P-P-E-R, you look at who did all the editorial pruning, all the markups of that speech in tandem with Barack. Other people self-advertise on this issue, not people from Springfield. But the unheralded person who deserves the most credit of all in helping Barack was Cooper.
Thomas Frank, who wrote What's the Matter with Kansas,
right?
Has compared Roosevelt's transition in 1932 from that crisis to the transition in 2008 and 2009, and has characterized it as a failure of Obama to learn from the lessons of Roosevelt. Was Obama well read on political history and those types of things, or was it just he didn't know what was coming?
I think the very direct, simple answer to that, and you can find instances where Barack himself has admitted this. Most of Barack's reading of choice across the years was fiction, not nonfiction political history. In that unpublished book manuscript that he and Rob Fisher wrote together in 1991, there are a few footnotes in that where it's clear that Barack has read a little bit about civil rights history. But when you see instances where Barack talks about how he got into public life, got into political life, because of how deeply inspired he was by the Black freedom struggle in the South, that's something of an exaggeration, because Barack is not that deeply schooled in the civil rights literature, and I would doubt that he ever read anything at all about that the Roosevelt transition. All of the letters that Barack was writing to friends all across the 1980s, 1990s, and this is, I should have mentioned this earlier, this is sort of the last pre-electronic president, because it's only in the late 1990s that communication moves to email. And so all the way up through at least the mid-1990s, Barack is writing all sorts of letters and postcards to friends, and there are dozens of people who thankfully have held on to all of these. But again and again across all those years, especially in the 1980s when Barack still had an aspiration of being a creative writer, the literature that one sees invoked in all of these letters is the creative writing of fiction, not American political history.
Hi, thank you. I'm just wondering, what would you say after all of your research and interviews is that driving fundamental underlying force and motivation for him to go into public life and service through politics?
I'll say two things separate in time. Sheila Yeager, whom I mentioned earlier, with whom Barack lived from 86 to 88 and remained very close into 1991, 1992. Sheila believes that Barack really transformed himself over a relatively brief period in 86, 87, and developed a very strong, pronounced ambition that had not been there when she first met him and became close to him in the summer of 1986. Now, I think that is in some significant part informed by Harold Washington as mayor of Chicago. Barack is very frustrated, very disappointed at how little tangible impact the community organizers can have down there on the far south side. There's a wonderful photo, Mike, across the way here in the Lincoln Museum of Mayor Washington meeting Barack's community leaders, Loretta Augustine and Dan Lee, down there on South Michigan Avenue in Roseland. And Barack is way in the back of this photo, and you'll recognize him. But Washington, as mayor, was this larger-than-life figure in Black Chicago, prior to his very sudden, untimely death in November of 1987. And by the end of 87, early 1988, Barack is telling his closest male friends, Mike Kruglich, Bruce Orenstein, that he's going to go to law school with a dream of being mayor of Chicago, because he thinks that in electoral office as mayor, that the mayor can have a real impact on improving people's lives. Simultaneously, he's saying to the two women he's closest to, Sheila and another woman, Lena Montez, who didn't know each other. To both Sheila and Lena, Barack is talking not about mayor, he's talking about the presidency. This is in early 1988. And I want to underscore my sort of methodology here. These are two women who contemporaneously were very close to Barack, never met each other. Lena knew of Sheila. Sheila did not know of Lena. And they both have almost word for word the same memories of what Barack is telling them. Michelle Robinson Obama's brother, Craig Robinson, has the same memory of Barack in early 1992, before he and Michelle marry, of mentioning the presidency to Craig. And Craig's reaction is, President? President of what? And so, I have a very strong crap detector. So one of the problems one sees in journalistic history is journalists who believe everything that anyone ever told them. And human memory makes plenty of errors. So I think of myself as a very tough cookie in terms of believing unlikely stories that people tell me. But when you have two entirely independent witnesses with the same exact story, Sheila and Lena, so this vision of the presidency is there by early 1988. Then, very quickly, secondly, after the congressional loss in the spring of 2000, Barack is very humiliated at having achieved 31% of the vote in challenging Bobby Rush. And I think it's in the wake of that loss, and we got lots of firsthand witnesses here with us this evening, in the 18 months or so after that humiliating defeat, I think the need to win, the importance of victory, becomes much more profoundly important for Barack than it ever had been up through 2000. Terry Martin, please.
Dave, very few biographers get to talk to the subject. They're writing decades after the person died. When you sat down in the White House with President Obama and he went over your manuscript with you, how, first of all, to what extent, it seems to me, do any of us know ourselves, but you triangulated, so to speak, his life? So when he goes, no, this isn't right, I don't agree with this, you're a reporter of his life. To what extent do you listen to him and go, I'll correct that, or, frankly, sir, you're wrong about your own life?
Terry, that's great. Thank you. I need to preface my response by mentioning, again, I said this very briefly earlier, that officially, reporters here know this very well, you know, everything that Barack said to me on these 3 different visits to the White House was off the record, so I'm not supposed to directly quote him. My first time there in April of 2016 was very much focused on 1987, 1988, what I mentioned earlier about Sheila Yeager and Lena Montez. When I went back again in first October and then December of 2016, after Barack had read the book manuscript and marked it up, there were, 4 or 5 dozen different particular little things with which Barack wanted to take issue. But as I said earlier, these were often, to my mind, rather trivial particulars. And more often than not, they involved Barack rejecting other people's memories of events and encounters and conversations. Now, frankly, Dreams from My Father, Barack's autobiographical memoir, as I say very forcefully, it is not a work of history, it is a work of historical fiction. And I know with complete certainty that that's going to be the long-term historical consensus. But I think I can very clearly say, without violating any Washington ground rules, that when you've written up your own semi-fictionalized version of your life, you have absorbed into your mind this composed version of your life. And so the composed version has taken priority, taken precedence over actual memory. All of the other witnesses, whether in Honolulu, whether in Hyde Park, whether in Cambridge, whether in Springfield, all of these other hundreds and hundreds of people, they haven't written a fictionalized version of the story. And so almost always, in my professional judgment as a historian who's been doing this for 40 years, the other witnesses' versions of history were more reliable than Barack's. Thank you. Oh, I didn't mean to. I was saying thank you to Terry. I wasn't meaning to. Mike's in charge of the clock. Chris Will's in the back.
One of the parts of your book that's gotten a lot of attention is your conclusion at the end that Obama is a vessel that's hollow at the core. And I'm curious how you distinguish between hollow at the core and a young man searching for purpose and eventually finding some. What brings you to the negative conclusion that he's hollow as opposed to the positive conclusion that he was building up toward something?
The Barack following 2001, 2002, I'm sort of following on to my answer about how important the need to win, the need for victory becomes to him after 2000. My frank feeling about his presidency, and I would cite the substance of Obamacare as one exemplar of this, and I say this as a left of Bernie Sanders democratic socialist who lived in Britain for many years and thinks that the National Health Service there is absolutely, phenomenally, vastly better than an insurance industry-dominated fee-for-service model that we have here. I think that Barack, as president, ended up as a prisoner of this need to win. Obamacare ends up being this phenomenal, ongoing gift to the for-profit insurance industry. And Barack and many of the people closest to him, embrace Obamacare as the legacy of the Obama presidency. But I do not view Obamacare as a progressive achievement or victory whatsoever. And so I believe that Barack's need to congratulate himself for having won ended up taking total precedence over a hard-eyed, clear-eyed focus on what's the actual transformative or non-transformative policy substance of what's being enacted. But again, as I stressed earlier, only about 1% of this book, which Chris is referring to, is actually about the presidency.
Do you think he was conscious that he was creating a fictionalized version of his life?
Yes.
That he needed, because to him his life had not been that. And so I can see how that would pertain to the hollowness. I mean, as a child, and you
yes.
go through that, and then that's why early childhood is so important.
When Barack is writing what becomes the final version of Dreams from My Father in 1993, 1994, it is very much intentionally a campaign book. One can find in the campaign journalism back in 07, 08, all of these reporters' assertions that, Barack published that book before he was ever thinking of being a political candidate. I mean, wrong, just flat out wrong. And I'm going to embarrass Bernie Schoenberg by citing him. But there's a great piece that Bernie did when he's quizzing Barack about these drug admission, the version that Barack has given to Bernie about drug usage versus what's in Dreams from My Father. And Barack ends up apologizing to Bernie for having given a less than fully accurate, frank answer. But Rob Fisher, whom I mentioned earlier, and the final title, Dreams from My Father, is, I think, really Rob Fisher's title, more so than anyone else's. But, I mean, Rob and Barack were working extensively on this. And how much Barack says about drugs in that book is a very consciously calculated, protective decision to get this out there so early that it could never come back to bite him. The truth, as I talk about in some detail in Chapter 3, in 1984 and 1985 in New York, just before he goes to Chicago, Barack is doing an awful lot of cocaine. This is not during high school. This is not during college. It's after college. He's, 23, 24 at that time. Now, I don't think this is a particularly momentous issue, but it's not something that Barack is accurate or honest about in Dreams. His closest friends at that time, Genevieve Cook, who's the woman he's in part living with, Genevieve's contemporaneous diary details just how much cocaine they're doing, 84, 85. The one other quick thing I want to say about Dreams is it is also very purposely crafted to make Barack's life dramatically more black in retrospect than what he had lived. He calls himself at one point in Dreams a thug when he's a high school student in Honolulu. Now, I mean, I interviewed dozens and dozens of classmates, probably close to 24 teachers and staff members from Punahou, and 100%, literally 100%, they remember this happy, friendly, outgoing young man, not someone who's showing up in class buzzed or drunk, which is the image Barack gives. Now, going back to Terry Martin's question, during my visits to D.C., this was a subject of some arm wrestling. But again, when you've got dozens and dozens of firsthand witnesses whom all agree, and one person who rejects the 100% consensus, I don't have a hard time, concluding, what's right and what's self-servingly inaccurate.
David, I wonder if you have any insights or reflections on why there were so many portions of his life that weren't examined by your fellow journalists.
Well, I should apologize, Mark. I mean, Mark's done great oral history work here in Illinois. I very much think of myself as an academic historian, so I sort of cringe at people thinking of me as a journalist, in all honesty. No. At times, I think that reporters back in 07, 08 thought it would be tacky to go look for the black candidates' girlfriends from the 1980s because they understood correctly that all of these girlfriends were not black. And I think the people around Barack's campaign very insistently sent the message to journalists that looking for personal life stories was low class and tacky. But that doesn't explain their failure, with perhaps one exception of an article in the Boston Globe. That doesn't explain their failure to find and appreciate the importance of Rob Fisher. So I don't think there is a comprehensive explanation for the journalistic failure. But I very much believe that the journalism on Barack in 07, 08 was a journalistic failure, a historical failure. I mean, that was a motivating factor for me to enrich the record beyond what was there.
What about Michelle, who's obviously brilliant and accomplished on her own? What effect did she have on him?
Again, there are people here tonight who can testify to this at firsthand much more strongly than I can. Right from 1992 up through the end of 2003, Michelle again and again and again is incredibly doubtful and dubious about Barack's political prospects and commitments. She, like her brother, had heard these, presidency comments. She didn't like him running for the state senate in the first place. She did not like him being in Springfield for reasons everybody here can guess at. And I immediately hasten to add that I don't think anyone ever, in my experience or otherwise, has ever heard anything negative about Barack's time here in Springfield, behavior-wise. But the congressional race in 2000, Michelle was almost actively opposed to that campaign during the campaign itself. And it was a matter of some pleading and negotiation before she unwillingly, gave a sort of passive consent to the Senate race in 2002, 2003. But what I really want to emphasize is how very quickly in early 2004 does it become obvious, become clear to people that this person whom most people had never taken particularly seriously as a potential statewide candidate, that he was likely to become the U.S. Senator. And that happens very quickly, sort of the latter part of January 2004 into early February of 2004, when Blair Hull goes off the rails, and then Dan Hines fails to get room temperature going much of anywhere. And one of the great strategic accomplishments of the Obama Senate campaign, and I think one that David Axelrod can correctly claim credit for, is how so much of the money during that campaign was all saved for late television. And the quality of those three final Obama U.S. Senate ads, particularly the Sheila Simon one that I think many people here can remember. Paul Simon dies unexpectedly and they'd been counting on a Paul Simon endorsement. And it's a very nice story that I tell thanks to Sheila Simon herself. But the power of that Sheila Simon ad, because of how much Sheila sounds like, looks like her dad, that's a tremendous beneficiary. But the speed with which Barack is propelled from an unknown state legislator as of even the beginning of 2004 to first a likely U.S. senator and then this national figure as of July, it's a 6-month elevation, acceleration at remarkable pace. I think we're about there on time. Mark?
I think we have one more question.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.